ever. Some of them didn't do anything and just fell into it. Ramana Maharshi was a 17-year-old high school student. He wasn't very religious. He was lying on his uncle's floor one day, studying, and he suddenly felt he was going to die. And instead of screaming out like most people would do, something clicked in him, and he said, well, all right, let me die. And he experienced himself as dying. And he experienced himself as being taken to the burning ghat and burned. And then there was an awareness still there. And at that point, he got his body up, and he went off, rode on a train, and arrived at this mountain called Arunachala. And he went up and he sat down in a cave, as if he was just drawn to that cave. And he sat in the cave for 6 months. And kids came and threw shit at him, and I mean, all that. And then pretty soon an old lady came and started putting rice grains between his lips. He was still there, just sitting there. And very slowly, over several years, he was brought back into consciousness. And after that, he was one of the highest living saints in India. Always with the simplest teachings, with such clarity and quantity, equanimity, and joy. What a beautiful being. So he didn't do anything to get. How did I meet my guru? I had taken a lot of drugs, and I realized that what they showed me I couldn't become because I didn't know enough, neither did anybody else that was using it, that I knew. So I thought there might be people in India that had maps that would understand these things, so I went looking for people with maps. And I gave up finally in Kathmandu after a short across India in the Land Rover. And then I met a young Westerner who was very far out in my consciousness, and he had been living in India for 7 years, and I met him, and he was barefoot on the streets of Nepal. And I decided, instead of going on to Japan and a visit with Alan Watts and things that I knew about what would be like, I'd be busy being who I was, I decided to stay with this guy and go back into India. So he went back in, living at temples. And finally, I started to burn out on this. I mean, it was a hard life. We were walking miles a day barefoot, and I had big blisters, and I had diarrhea, and the whole thing was a lot. And I was thinking, maybe I'll go back to the United States, do something else. And he said, I've got to go see my guru, because I've got to get my visa extended. And we had been left this Land Rover after the guy who owned it in Nepal. He went to Japan, and he left it in the care of me and an Indian man. This young Westerner said, get the Land Rover and we'll go see my guru. And I said, well, I don't want to just get the Land Rover. He forced me to do what he was told. So we were driving this Land Rover I didn't want to be in. I had been smoking a lot of hash, and I was very hungover. And I wanted to go back to America, and I was really depressed, and I had diarrhea. And we're driving, and as we're going up into the mountains, as we're going up into the mountains, this young guy who's 6'5", and he's got a long golden beard and long hair and beads like this. And he's crazy, mad, absolutely. He's sobbing, and I'm just hungover, and I wish we hadn't borrowed the Land Rover, and I want to go home. And finally, he pulls up to a little temple by the side of the road, and Indians come. With a Land Rover, you're instant crowd in India. You go to pee out in the jungle, and you think you're alone, and there's 30 people watching you by the time you finish. So we stop, and a crowd surrounds him. He speaks to them, and then he goes rushing off up a hill. And I'm sitting there, and they're all looking at me, and they're pointing up the hill. And I don't even want to see this guy, this guru business. I don't even like Hinduism. It's schlock. It's got too much fluorescent lights and calendar art. And it's not, I'm a Buddhist, see, and I like the kind of... So I'm just going to sit there, but they keep pushing me. So I go up this long, stony path, and I come around into this open field, and there's a tree, and under the tree is an old man sitting, and there's about 5 or 6 Indians sitting around him. And this young guy I'm with is doing Danda Pranam. He's out flat on his face, touching this guy's feet. And I think to myself, I'm not going to do that. And I'm standing there. I remember I'm an ex-Harvard professor, you know. I still got something left, no matter how much brain damage you have. So I'm standing there thinking, I'm not going to do that. And the old man looks up and he says in Hindi, which I understand a little of and was translated also, he said, he looks at me and he says, "You came in a big car?" Damn Land Rover, you know. I said, "Yeah." He looks at me and says, "You'll give it to me?" I mean, I've been hustled before, but you didn't even build the hook. So I said, "Well, it's not my car," because this kid looks up and he says, "If you want it, Maharaji, it's yours." See, Maharaji is a word that means great king, and it's given to all holy men. It doesn't mean a certain person called Maharaji. And I said to him, "You can't give away David's car," and I'm getting all upset. Everybody's laughing at me. Imagine how paranoid I'm getting. So he looks at me and he says, "You made much money in America?" So it was like feeding my ego a little bit. "Well, you know, I was a dealer, and, you know, very well." And I mentioned a sum, and it was like half the national debt of India, you know. Everybody was impressed, you know. So he said, "You'll buy a car like that for me?" Like, if you've got so much money, you may not give me David's car, but you'll certainly buy me a Land Rover. So, I mean, I'm being blown out, you know. So I said, "Well, maybe." So finally, he says to them, take him and feed him." So they take me and they take this guy that was with me, and we're being fed. Now, let me tell you, the night before we got into the Land Rover to come up to the mountains, we were staying at a house, and during the night I had to go out and go to the toilet. And while I was going to the toilet, the stars were out very bright, and I was very aware of the stars. They seemed very close because there was no electricity. And I thought about my mother, who had died 6 months previously. And I felt her presence. I just felt it, and I went back to bed. You know, it's one of those things that happens to you, which you just, maybe you make a note in a diary if you keep it, otherwise nobody's interested, you know. So after this meal, up now the next day, I'm called back and I'm sat down in front of this guy, and he says to me, looks at me, and he's this big fat guy in a blanket, and he looks like he's stoned out of his mind. You know? You know. He says, "You run under the stars last night?" So I figured, well, it doesn't take much mind guessing in India. I mean, you're always under the stars. I said, "Yeah." He said, closed his eyes for a second. He said, "You were thinking about your mother." That's pretty good. He said, closed his eyes again. He said, "She died last year." Then I started to freak. I mean, my paranoia got so extreme. I mean, I had him as a CIA thing with push a button and the earth opens up and files come out. I mean, no way. I mean, I'm a Harvard professor, a rational, you know, at some level. He is like, "Yes," I said. And she died of spleen, an enlarged spleen that made her look pregnant. And he closed his eyes for me. He said, "She got very big in the belly before she died." And I said, "Yeah." This is all in Hindi. And then in English, he says one word to me. I mean, I never knew he spoke English. He hardly ever spoke English. He came up close to me and he said, "Spleen." The organ my mother died of. Okay? He says, "Spleen." And he looks in my eyes. And I feel in my chest a violence. I can just tell you, it's like opening a door. If ever you saw an old radio show called Inner Sanctum, where the door squeaks open. It's like an old door that can barely open. And I started to sob, and I cried for 2 days. I didn't even know what I was crying about. I couldn't stop crying. And it was as if when my mind couldn't handle the rational, analytic stuff, it went tilt. And the minute my mind finally shut up, my heart could open. But usually my mind kept such a clamp on my heart that it couldn't open. And what he did was he blew my mind. Okay, is that a fair statement? That's how it happened. Questions?
Could you tell us some more stories?
There are great stories about Maharaji. Like years ago, he's at a barber, and the barbers are outdoor barbers, and he's sitting in the barber, and he's being shaved by the barber. That's a thing in India. You know, there are street barbers. You just sit on a little stool and they shave. And he's being shaved, and the barber is telling him how upset he is because he's getting old, and his son left years ago, and he doesn't know where his son is, and now when a father should have a son around him, he doesn't know where he is, and he's very distraught, and he lathered up Maharaji's face, and he shaves the face, shaving the face, and Maharaji says, "Stop, I gotta pee." And he gets up, and he goes out behind a building, and he's gone about 2 minutes. And then he comes in and sits down, and the barber finishes shaving him. And Maharaji leaves, and as he's leaving, he said, "Maybe if it's God's will, your son will come back." The next day, the barber's son arrived. And the barber said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get here?" The son says, "I don't know. I'm as mystified as you are." He said, "I'm the manager in a hotel about 300 miles from here, in this particular town." He said, "I was standing behind the desk yesterday, and this man ran in the door, and he had shaving cream on half his face. And he said, 'Go home, your father needs you.'" And he ran out again.
Harvard came to their senses and invited you back, how in the world would you tell that story to our new educators so that they would be able to understand it?
I had an interesting experience. I was with a fellow named George Feynman, a fellow named Feynman. He was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, just died recently. You know who I'm Richard Feynman. And we were hanging out at John Lilly's house up in Malibu. And Feynman heard that I had a guru, and so he asked me to tell him some stories. So I would tell him these guru stories. And each one would go into his computer mind, and then he'd say, "Yeah, that's possible." And he was doing fine. I mean, we were going along fine. He was, "Yeah, that's possible. Possible, that's fine." I mean, I'm not interested in talking to people whose minds are closed, but somebody that's a real scientist or a real seeker after truth, whatever form. So then he got to the point where I told him this story about how Maharaji was in Allahabad, and there was going to be a temple opening at a town named Lucknow. And they said to Maharaji, "Are you going for that?" He says, "Oh no, I'm going to stay here." And he said, "I want to be put in my bedroom, and I want you to guard the door to see nobody comes out." And they have these slide bolts in India, where they have separate bolts on inside and outside. So if it's bolted from the outside, you can't open it from inside. So Maharaji went into this room, and they bolted the door, and there are bars on the windows because of the monkeys in India. So it's the bars and the doors bolted. And for 5 hours, they have somebody out front, and Maharaji's in there doing whatever he does. And then he knocks and screams, and they open the door, and they feed him, and everything goes on fine. So the next day, the people come from the Lucknow temple to Allahabad, and they say it was a great temple opening. And one of the guys from Allahabad said how great it could be. Maharaji wasn't there. And the guy turned to him and said, "What do you mean he wasn't there?" He was there. He came down the street. We fed him, took care of him. And then at one point he said, "I got to go. I got to go." He ran out into the woods. So now what I was saying to this Richard Feynman was that Maharaji was in two places at once. He says, "No, I can't accept that." So why can't you accept that? He says, "Because if I accept that, the whole basis for my understanding of the physical universe is off." I said to him, "Well, you do have a problem." how to answer you, actually. I mean, there are certain ones, like, I think the kind of thing you're asking. Like Dave McClellan was my professor. He was the guy that fired me at Harvard on the first level before Nathan Pusey fired me. And David is a very beautiful psychologist. He had a wife who was really a saint. She was a beautiful artist. And they went to India for the Ford Foundation, studying how to make Indians into middle management. I won't discuss the morality of that, but we'll just look at that. In the course of it, he came to visit Maharaji because he knew I was involved with Maharaji. I mean, we kept friendship even though he threw me out of Harvard. We still stayed friends. I'm the godfather to his children and all that stuff. While he was there, his wife was sitting in front of Maharaji doing a sketch of Maharaji, and then she handed it to him and he looked at it. She's a very fine artist, and he wrote Ram, 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 Ram about it and gave it back. She went home that night, and she had only been sick once in her life, extraordinary woman, and she got extremely sick. They would leave the next day for Pakistan, the Ford Foundation party. The next morning, she was so sick, the doctor came and said she can't be moved for 2 weeks. She had pneumonia. She was really ill. Couldn't get up out of bed. David went to Maharaji to say goodbye or to say what had happened. He told Maharaji, and Maharaji closed his eyes and said, "She'll be all right." And at that moment, back in the hotel, Mary sat up and said, "Gee, I feel wonderful. We can go to Pakistan." And they went. Now, what effect that had on David? I mean, that's getting the guy where his wife lives, you know. I mean, that's getting him at home port. And to take a scientist and face him with that, it's the same thing that happened to me, except he tried to keep reconciling it back into academia. And he's had a whole series of spiritual teachers since then. And he works with a man named Hugo in Switzerland. Spiritual teacher. I don't know, you're my first foray back into college academia that feels good and all. In about 20 years. You know, every time I went to a college, it just felt like I had no business there. Everybody's so busy, whatever they're doing, becoming whoever they think they're supposed to be. They don't have any space. So I don't know how it is. Maybe this is the beginning of something. Maybe they'll start all over. I mean, most of my lectures are public lectures in the city, and people come and want to come. My audiences went, in the 60s, my audiences were between 15 and 25 years old. And then for a period of time, they kept growing older and older with me. And then something happened. They're all kind of yuppie stockbrokers now, you know. And then at some point, something happened in the culture and it broadened out again. And I started to pick up the 75-year-olds and the people from Des Moines, Iowa, and people who you wouldn't expect. I mean, they're not people that ever smoked dope. They're not people who read Eastern books. I mean, and you sit there and you say something really far out and you go, yeah. How did I know? Cultural conspiracy. Am I dealing with your question at all?
I was wondering what along that same line, what your attitudes were towards the sort of recent resurgence of 60s idealism, all the media attention paid to Woodstock and the Summer of Love and being so.
I think that there is, whenever anything has any juice in a culture, the power players immediately focus around it to use the energy. They're like hungry ghosts, but Tibetan Buddhism. Hungry ghosts are they're praetorians. They're beings that have huge bellies, but they have a long, thin beak, and they can't get food in, except by a drop at a time, so they're always hungry. They're called the hungry ghosts. And that's what power players are around something that has any juice to it. So the Woodstock memory had juice to it, so it was, in a way, trivialized a lot by the way it was dealt with this year. I think that like my friends, the dead, and they went from playing 15 to 20,000 halls to now they're 40 to 60,000 halls, which has been horrible beautiful because the whole violence it's done to deadheads is incredible compared to the numbers of other kinds of people it's getting to. So it's coming back in, and there's always a fad element in all this stuff. But there's also some seed of truth in it. I mean, that in a way, there is a realization that what was thrown away after the Vietnam War of the 60s, when the 60s turned sour because of its impurities, really, that they threw out the baby with the bath, and that was something very precious. Because I think what happened in the 60s is so profound. I don't think it's ever characterized as to how profound it was. Because what I think happened was that psychedelics and the zeitgeist and the whatever that all was at that moment in those first half of the 60s, that did to social consciousness what Einstein did to Newton. Because Einstein came along and said, what you say is real is relatively real. It depends on where you're standing. In other words, it was a perspective shift. It was by going to a meta-consciousness. And in a way, psychedelics did the same thing. And the rock movement then that followed, and all the stuff that followed out of that, was saying the realities that we grew up thinking were absolutely real are only relatively real. And that disempowers all existing social institutions. Everything's up for grabs again if it's only relatively real. Because then if I see it differently, then you see it, and you don't like how I'm seeing it, that's your problem, not mine. Even if you're the institutions of the society. Question? Somebody else.
I heard you here this morning. I thought you said that in '73 your guru died.
Yeah.
And if so, is communication still established between you and him, and on what level?
It's interesting. When he died, I thought, since a lot of the people around him were bereft, I mean, they really felt they lost their connection. Since every time I was with him, he went jiao, which means get lost, split. He threw me out all the time. He never let me hang around him very much. That most of the relationship I had with him was in the distance, not in the presence. So I didn't get too hooked on his form. I got hooked on that way he was dialoguing with me inwardly, rather than externally. And that dialogue didn't seem to be affected by his death. It seemed to go on with me. And if I quieted down enough and stopped saying, look, you're just talking to some imaginary playmate your psychosis is creating. If I just let it go and just opened to it and said, sure, why not? Then I found myself continually being transformed by the life experiences around me. Because it was as if he was handing me life experiences in order to bring me more into his truth, or into love, or into light, or into whatever. So I have a dialogue. In fact, you are part of my dialogue with him at this moment. Just like I am being used by you to awaken, you are being used by me to awaken. Because the greatest gift we can give each other is to awaken. You hear that? So when somebody says, "What you've done so much good for me, what can I do for you?" I say, get free. It's the best thing you can do for me. Question?
Yeah, in terms of our function here, how can we see where we might fit?
In terms of our function here on Earth, how can we see how we might fit in? You keep as open a mind as you possibly can. That means no models and no expectations. You do what you need to do. You can have a career, anything, as long as you stay open to the freshness of each moment and you keep listening. And you don't demand. There's a great story about Gandhi that he was leading a salt march, one of those protest marches against the English. And he had tens of thousands of people following him. And at one point, he stopped the march and disbanded it. And his lieutenant said to him, "Gandhiji, you can't do that. These people have left their jobs, they've left their homes to follow you. You can't do that." And he said to them, he said, God is absolute truth. I am only relative truth. I only know a little bit each day. My understanding of truth deepens from day to day. And unfortunately, my commitment must be to truth, not to consistency. I'm sorry. Now you think about a career and a plan. I'm going to be a this, and then 20 years down the line you're that. That's fine. But if you get caught in that consistency, for some reason of wanting to be consistent, you lose it. While you may end up being, do you hear what I'm saying? So you keep listening. And I mean, there's nothing in who I was when I was your age that would have prepared me to be who I am now. I had no prediction. If you thought of the categories my mind went in those days, there wasn't a category for what I am. So how could I plan for it? You hear that? Yeah.
There's certain things in life that we know would be really good if we incorporated them into our life, but it seems like we don't do them. Wondering how you feel about that.
Like what?
Why don't we do what's right? Do what's right.
Well, I've got to work with the term first, what's right. I will only accept what's right as what is intuitively feeling right. I'm not talking about what culture defines as right. That may or may not be right, you understand? I'm not talking about an externalized good evil. I'm talking about an inner sense of goodness. Why don't you always do what you know to be good? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure we're clear. I think you develop a lot of appreciation of the poignancy of your human predicament. Nice way to say it. And that you have, like the Buddha pointed out, and I just use it because he said it so nicely. The Buddha pointed out that all of us that take birth on earth have the 5 hindrances. Lust and greed, that's the first one. Hatred and ill will, sloth and torpor, agitation and doubt. So that's the nature of the human condition. I mean, you watch a baby start from that and grabbing, and you can feel the whole quality of wanting and the identification with wanting. That's the greed one. And how it develops and how we cultivate it and so on. And those 5 things are, in a way, a profile of who's on earth. Plus the factors of enlightenment, of wanting to awaken and wanting to do good and wanting to be in harmony with the universe and so on. But these are forces in us that are very strong, and they're very deeply conditioned. We identify. When you feel hungry, you really think you're hungry. And out of that feeling and identifying with the hungriness, instead of not just saying there's hunger, but I'm hungry, starts all the suffering of the world right there. You hear what kind of an answer I'm trying to give you? So in a way, we're doing the best we can. And we keep hearing a little better, and then we lose it again. We lose it into the other parts of our desire systems, our identification. And as you quiet down, then you don't do things which create suffering. Because you don't lose consciousness. The minute you lose consciousness into a desire, you do things that create suffering. Subtle though they may be. Wanting to possess your lover, for example. That's a clinging. That's romantic love as opposed to conscious love. Look back. There's 2 of you there. There's 3 of you in a line. So start from the back, girl. You. One behind you.
Okay. What is fear to you?
What is what?
What is fear to you?
Fear is the result of ignorance. And the ignorance is that one gets caught in thinking one is separate. That's the root cause of fear. And everything from then on, the minute you've identified with your separateness, from then on you are very vulnerable and you're in a very powerful force field and you better be very careful. And you're frightened all